I want to thank the Clariness group in particular for inviting me here today and for really bringing us all together in this forum. I think that at the center of the transformation that we need, it is really more leader companies like Clariness bringing kind of disparate groups together to learn from and to advance our collaboration. So what I want to talk about today is from a site perspective, what we really view to be the 3 Cs of patient centricity. So what are those 3 Cs? Collaboration, we're going to talk about the need for better collaboration at the site level and throughout the entire ecosystem. Choice, empowering patients to have the choice of participating in clinical trials. And I'm even more passionate about making that happen, especially after hearing from our patients today. And then understanding, as we heard from our last panel, that really there is a patient wrapped around the tumor or the migraine headache or the MS. And so understanding the position of clinical research as part of the whole entire continuum of care. So just to kind of level set as far as PMG Research in our organization, we were founded in 1979 by a gastroenterologist who was in private practice, who I think felt a calling to offer clinical trials as a care option to patients in a community setting that otherwise would not be available to them. If you fast forward to today, 7,700 trials later, we have brought the clinical trial experience to over 100,000 people as direct, qualified patient participants. One thing that I would like to really talk about, as far as within the platform that we are trying to advance, it is really about reframing clinical trials, getting out of a little bit of that silo thinking that clinical trials is something that is done by a few, apart from the mainstream system. So in our relationships that we have, we really are a full service, kind of describe it as the CRO to healthcare. So we really bring a comprehensive clinical research infrastructure, research coordinators, regulatory, site level people, contracts negotiators, budget negotiators, finding the right trials for the right patients to the right providers. Those are all services that we provide to healthcare systems. We really have changed very much our approach over the past couple of years. I can tell you that until recently, we went to physicians, oftentimes in separate practices, and we were asking for people as a favor, in a way, to be involved in clinical research. And I think that through data, and if you take a real data-driven approach, the value of what clinical trials brings to the patient, to the healthcare system, to, again, the entire system, is really staggering. So our approach today is that really clinical research is a privilege. And it is something that we are approaching with respect to our healthcare providers as being some absolute must-haves, not nice to be, but must-haves. So in our journey forward, we are looking for partners that inherently see the value of bringing clinical trials to all patients within their healthcare system. That clinical research really is an equal opportunity process, and one in which that we're going to build the relationship, we're going to build the culture, the structure within those relationships to ensure that every patient within that practice becomes informed about clinical research, educated about clinical research, that we are building the technology, that we are building the motivation for the physician investigators within that system to make it available to all. So through that process, some really important steps in this, we do a very comprehensive due diligence and ensuring that these are systems, healthcare systems, that are largely supported by the administration, that sees that clinical research is in fact really a benefit to their patient population and also to the physicians and providers within that system. There's a compelling value proposition, so again, that the administration sees that clinical research isn't something that's just a sideline hobby for a few physicians, but rather it is something that complements the goals and objectives of the healthcare institution, which are pretty universal. And those universal considerations are every administrator, especially in the US, but I think actually on a global basis, their primary concern is improved outcomes for patients, reduction in cost of care, and what that patient experience is really like. And we have some really compelling data that actually shows that clinical research as a catalyst supports what really would be termed as kind of that triple aim. We look for an internal research champion. So we do look for a core base of physicians who, whether they will be directly involved as principal investigators or just advocates within the healthcare system, that they are going to serve as the ambassadors to educate and rally the troops in terms of their peers to promote clinical research. And again, make sure that everybody within that institution, all patients, all providers, have the opportunity to participate. We develop an internal and external communication strategy. We really see that within the thread of these organizations, and I'll talk about the characteristics of these organizations in a few minutes, but we really do develop a very specific internal and external communication strategy. And again, I've got some data that will support that. And then we also see that, again, clinical research serves as a catalyst for a dynamic learning environment within that healthcare system. If you think about clinical research, we are constantly learning. It is about cutting edge. It is about ongoing education. And within a healthcare system, that brings about a very dynamic learning type of environment. As far as the first C, choice, again, the patient perspective. Despite sometimes popular belief that patients don't want to participate in long-term trials, we have been following and collecting some data that I think is important data. And so if you look at some national benchmarking as far as the patient experience, companies like Press Ganey, for example, the advisory board, there are large data companies that measure patient satisfaction for healthcare systems. If you look at the national benchmark with 5 on a Likert scale, with 5 being the most satisfied, right now where we are, generally speaking, as far as patient experience, within the more probably sophisticated healthcare systems, we're ranking somewhere a little above 4.5 as a national average. When we looked at a cohort of patients, and this was a large group of diabetic patients that were enrolled across a number of trials, not just one trial, but a number of trials. When we looked at that particular patient population within one of the healthcare systems that we provide service to, you can actually see that there is a little bit of a selection bias, that people, before going into a study, tend to be a little more satisfied. So there is a correlation with people who actually say yes to a clinical trial. Generally speaking, they're going to be a little more satisfied with their healthcare provider. We then looked at a set of data as far as these patients just going into the trial. You can see that patients going into the trial early on, and I think that this was after 6 months of trial participation, you can see that from a satisfaction standpoint, there was a pretty significant increase. And then you can see, as far as that sustained experience over a year later, there's a sustained, very high level of satisfaction. So why is that? And you can kind of read for yourself. These are actual comments that came back from the survey that was conducted by an outside party. But generally speaking, and other speakers have touched on this today, if we think about clinical research, it's a very high touch experience for patients. Patients do get more contact. I think that was a point that was made a little earlier. more contact from a care standpoint. They're certainly getting more education. We've heard from several of the patient panelists in terms of the demands of physician time, which is a real issue. In the case of clinical research within our organization, yes, physicians are they're involved in clinical research, and they're also conducting normal full load practice. But the fact that they have research coordinators, study personnel that are able to supplement that patient experience. From a data standpoint within our organization, when we finished 2015, our average coordinator is actually conducting 1.56 patient contact visits per day. That's so vastly different if you think about mainstream medicine with a nurse or a medical assistant or another provider, perhaps handling a volume of maybe somewhere around 30 contacts per day. So it's a very high-touch process, and that's what we really attribute that stellar patient experience to. Second C, continuum of care. We recently surveyed within one of our healthcare systems 192 providers within this particular organization to try to really get better insight in terms of physician motivation or demotivation, perhaps, for advocating for participating in clinical research. We were pleased in terms of getting a 41% response rate, and there is a large data set that backs this. What we did find from this, and again, this was a consultant that worked with us from the outside that conducted this research and surveyed these physicians. But the insights that we really gathered is that there are really three types of physicians. There are the protesters. And again, I think that this data aligns very nicely with the data that we heard a little earlier today, first presentation from Anik. 8% of the total respondents within this healthcare system were defined as protesters. And the bottom line is the protesters see absolutely no value to clinical research. They don't understand the benefits to patients, they don't understand the benefit to their organization, and they don't understand the what's in it for them. So they're flat out protesters. Then there are the targets. So this is what we get really excited about, because this is the 72%. This is where the real opportunity is. And as far as developing strategy and how we are going to start really tackling the targets, that's where a lot of our energy is going to be. But what we found from this is that 72% were identified as targets. And these were people that, again, by data, saw that there was some benefit, some perceived benefit in terms of clinical research. And some of that perceived benefit came from actual involved investigators, but in fact there were quite a few targets that were physicians who were not active as principal investigator or sub-investigator. So in this case, they saw that there was some benefit, but they could kind of go one way or the other. And then the champions, 20% of the respondents very clearly saw that clinical research as a care option for patients was beneficial. They saw that it put them in a more active, dynamic learning environment, so they saw that that was what was in it for them. They saw that they were viewed to be more credible by their patients, that their patients liked them more. So again, a whole host of data that really came out of that. Some additional insights that we got in terms of the physician's perspective on research benefits. You can see that largely when asked the question, clinical research benefits my patients, we did see within this particular health system, and we've done a lot of work. We have done a lot of work with this particular group in bringing data forth to them, but it showed that we still have some work to do. But by and large, that actually physicians see that clinical research provides patients with healthcare options they might not otherwise have. And then as far as clinical research benefits me as a physician, again, you can see from C and D that by and large the group saw that it is a valuable care option that decreases cost. and also provides them the opportunity to advance the practice with additional knowledge. Now, with respect to the data in terms of decreasing cost within the same healthcare system, I don't have this data within this presentation, but within this particular healthcare system, we have done some pretty deep dives in terms of the data that supports reduction of cost of care. So when we looked at two special patient populations, diabetic patients, and then we also looked at a group of high-risk cardiovascular patients involved in a long-term cardiovascular outcomes trial, we actually saw in these two patient populations reduction of cost of care while participating in clinical trials anywhere in the neighborhood of 60% to 70% reduction of cost of care. So to a healthcare system, you can imagine that the value proposition of clinical research starts taking on a whole new meaning. So what are we doing with the information as far as physician engagement? And again, I know that this conference is really dedicated to patient centricity, but I felt like it was important for us to be talking about the physician and the provider as the partner to the patient. And that's been validated. All of our patients really very clearly made that point, that what we have to be doing as an industry is bringing the two together. And there is a real call to action, I think, as far as elevating the engagement coming from our physicians and getting to some of the root cause of why we have physicians and healthcare institutions somewhat detached from the clinical research process. Some specific communication strategies that we are developing, we understand that within the three different phenotypes, we have to be communicating in very, very different ways. The champions are kind of easy. The champions are the ones that they already get it. We just need to continue to fortify that. So just ensuring that something so simple as when we have patient survey, that we're giving them that feedback directly. I mean, I do strongly believe, sometimes we can have a jaded view of physicians, but I strongly believe that people who became physicians want to help people. So something just as simple as in a very, very simple way, just reminding them of the impact and what they're doing with patients and how meaningful that is a good way to continue to reinforce and keep them as a champion. The targets, we're seeing that one specific strategy is, perhaps we need to connect that physician with a mentor. Somebody else, another physician, whether it's the same type of subspecialist or another physician within another practice that has had success in clinical research, maybe just kind of sharing that learning experience is a way to really help take that target and move that target to become a champion. And then the protesters, again, if any of you have read the book Strengths Finders, you're not supposed to put all of your energy into the weaknesses. But I'm still pretty passionate that even with 8% of physicians out there who are protesters, there's a lot of work that we need to do to ensure that we're breaking down those barriers, because at the end of the day, there would be nothing worse for a patient to be motivated and interested to be in a clinical trial, ready to go into a clinical trial, and then to encounter a protester. I wanted to give you just kind of one case study as far as the groups that we really are targeting now. And we have implemented a very different strategy over the past couple of years. Until a few years ago, as an organization, we worked with a lot of doctors in the communities for which we served in a very disparate way. And not that that work and those groups are any less meaningful, but it's becoming challenging. We know that the burden of clinical trials, the regulatory environment that we're in, there are a lot of challenges that we're facing. So a very disparate operational model is increasingly harder and harder to manage. So where we have really shifted our focus to is looking for what I would describe as middle market organized systems of care. So these are groups that are large multi-specialty groups generally somewhere in the neighborhood of 150 to 300 physician providers in a very close geography, under one electronic health record, serving a patient population of, let's say, 300,000 to 1 million active patient lives in their service area. Those are the groups that we're really targeting and building those relationships out with. About 1.5 years ago, there's a large group in Illinois, it's actually in Champaign, Illinois. They've been involved in clinical research since 1976. They've had a clinical research department, somewhat robust, but over the course of the years, they were struggling more and more from a financial standpoint to really keep the department moving. They're an accountable care organization. Accountable care is part of healthcare reform, and it is a designation by CMS. And accountable care organizations generally include a target population, at-risk patient population, and CMS will reimburse basically an amount per life covered. And so it's up to that organization to manage the cost for that particular patient population within that financial profile. We see that with respect to clinical research is an excellent countermeasure to an accountable care organization. Going back to the data that I had in terms of reduction of cost of care, you can see that as a countermeasure to the ACO activities, that's a real benefit to have a fairly robust clinical research offering that will actually help offset some of the cost of care. So in this particular case, you can see the characteristic from this group. We entered into an integrated services agreement, basically took over the management. The research department had a back-end function in terms of being able to scale that group, and that happened in May of 2015. If you look at where we are projecting by the end of 2016, we have had a fairly substantial increase in terms of the number of physicians engaged in research. In May of 2015, we had 8 physicians within this organization involved in research, 8 physicians offering clinical research to the entire base of patients. We now have grown that to 31 physicians within the group. If you look at the research staff, we've almost doubled the research staff. We have far more than doubled our output in terms of patients enrolled in trials, number of trials, but you can see there's a real focus on the operational efficacy and efficiency of that particular group. And that's another thing I wanted to really mention to this group that's been pretty eye-opening to me in the past couple of years, and it's really the economics behind clinical research. There's been mention of some of the major cancer centers, and recently we have started some collaboration and some sharing of data and information with MD Anderson. And Dr. Tom Veely, who is the head of cancer innovation at MD Anderson, says that in today's world, MD Anderson makes a calculated business decision every time they offer a clinical trial to a cancer patient, because the cost of care for that cancer patient will cost the institution more than a patient not enrolled in a clinical trial. Now, I had one colleague a few months ago say to me, CRO colleague, say to me, well, Jennifer, that's really not our problem. That's really their problem. And therein lies the problem. Because it's all of our problem. And for the record, I don't believe that the solution to this is that pharma spend more. It's just we know from an operationalization standpoint, there's a lot of inefficiency, and whether it's from the sponsor to the CRO, from the sponsor directly to the site, the CRO to the site. So those are things that we are diligently working on and trying to streamline and reduce a lot of the waste. And again, you know, the call to action that I heard from the last panel is we have an obligation to do that because there are other therapies. We can be applying our resources in a way that accelerates, I think, some better outcomes for patients. And you can see, philosophically with these agreements now that clinical research is actually a benefit, and it is an honor and a privilege to bring it to your patient population. And so if you reframe within that institution that clinical research, again, will be a care option for all, you can see we've already made some fairly significant advances. And this is only in the course of the past 17 months. So this has not been a long process that's taken us 10 years. It's been lessons learned from some of our other institutional partners in how we really are advancing engagement at the physician-provider level. And a big key to this, and I had this on an earlier slide, but a big key to this, I think, is as an industry, we are very, very centered on establishing relationships with individual physicians. We need to be very intentional about establishing relationships with the administrators within these healthcare systems, because it's the administrators who are going to help create that environment and the motivation for the physicians to be successful and to be able to offer clinical research to more. Of course, within these ACO, middle market organized systems of care, a huge advantage is that we have large access to identified, and I want to underscore identified, not de-identified, but identified patients through the EHR. So it makes for a very, very efficient, we can go in and we can basically look from a pre-feasibility or feasibility standpoint, we can look across a large patient population within the one system of anywhere from, like I said, 300,000 to 1 million patients, and really be able to pinpoint that. And we're not looking at it from a silo standpoint in terms of looking at Dr. Smith's patients alone. We're looking at it across the entire system, and then allows us to be in a position to customize a very, very specific recruitment and study logistic approach based on who are going to be the best providers within that organization and exactly where we're going to find those patients. So the example that I used a little earlier, pharma might say that we have to have a pulmonologist as the principal investigator, but in fact we know when we go in and we look across the entire patient population that more of those patients are actually being followed by primary care physicians. And we need the primary care physicians as the gatekeepers and the educators of the patient population. So these are just some comments that we have had recently from this particular group. Again, it's just a great example of experienced, motivated people who have been doing research for a long, long time, but just kind of stepping back, maybe taking a different approach to it, and interjecting now what I'm going to include as the fourth C, which I think is really, really important, is a culture shift as the fourth C. And so the culture shift is that we as an institution see that we have a moral and ethical responsibility to at least make clinical trial awareness and access to all patients. It is now part of our calling. I think it is, patients as partners with us being very intentional about bringing along the entire support system. And the healthcare system is a really important piece of that. Thank you.